Israel and Hamas have agreed to extend the ceasefire for 2 more days. 11 more hostages were released from Gaza yesterday, and 20 more are expected to be freed soon.
After weeks of pro-Palestinian demonstrations in London, more than 100,000 people gathered in Britain's capital to protest anti-Semitism. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
On Monday, 11 Israelis, including 2 mothers and 9 children, returned home after 52 days in captivity by Hamas. Among the reunions, 15-year-old Daphne and her 8-year-old sister Ella, who are now with their birth mother. Hamas murdered their father, stepmother, and stepbrother in kibbutz near Oz.
We are full with joy and happiness, but at the same time, we're very worried about the father, my cousin, Ofer Calderon, who's still in captivity. And I hope that we can, get to the release of the rest of the hostages, all of them, and the missing ones, since October 7th.
The hostages report food was running low during the last 2 weeks, and until the last moment, they weren't sure they'd make it home. When leaving, some thought the crowds would lynch them on the way to Israel. The White House expects more reunions.
That's really the goal here, get all the hostages home with their families where they belong. And however long that could take.
Yet Kirby says the White House is skeptical of how Hamas may use the ceasefire.
It's a real risk. You have to expect a group like Hamas, a terrorist group, which clearly doesn't abide by laws of war, will try to take advantage of any pause in the fighting for their own benefit. So we're watching that closely, as well as our Israeli counterparts. You can bet that they're watching that closely.
Bring them home!
Meanwhile, after huge pro-Palestinian marches in London, on Monday, more than 100,000 marched in Britain's capital against anti-Semitism.
Anything which is associated with the Jewish religion now feel that they're under attack and they have to look after themselves, have their own security. I never thought this would get to this stage in this country, and it's very, very upsetting to see it.
And in New York City, Mayor Eric Adams blasted high school students who forced their Jewish teacher to hide in her office after they found out she took part in a pro-Israel rally. In Vermont, a man accused of shooting 3 Palestinian students pled not guilty. Authorities are searching for evidence of a hate crime. On Monday, Ellon Musk, who has been criticized for endorsing an anti-Semitic tweet, went with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on a tour of one of the kibbutzes Hamas destroyed on October 7th. Musk also saw some of the raw footage of Hamas's atrocities.
I would say an emotionally difficult day to see the places where people were murdered, and to also watch the video where the murderers are rejoicing.
Exactly, that's the worst part in the movie.
Yes.
I was shocked by it. Celebrating
the murder of innocent people is extremely disturbing.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, joining us now is Dr. Leiter. He's the former chief of staff to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This month, he lost his son, a major in the IDF, in the fighting in Gaza. He joins us now from Tel Aviv. Dr. Leiter, thanks for joining with us, and our deepest condolences on the loss of your son. Tell us what happened during his service in Gaza.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and thank you for your heartfelt wishes, condolences. My son was a squadron commander in a rather well-known division, an Israeli reservist. He had spent 15 years in what is our equivalent of the American Delta Force. It's called the Shaldag unit. And in that capacity, he was the commander of the Point squadron for the entire division. So basically, we're talking about a division of about 2,000 soldiers that entered Beit Hanun, the northern area of the Gaza Strip, which was used as terror bases to fire missiles into our cities. He went through 2 weeks of intensive battles. He led the division into battle, very successful, had very few injured soldiers. He was a very careful major. He was very experienced. He knew the battlefield very well. But they went into what was a very extensive and detailed booby-trapped tunnel. and he was killed along with 3 of his fellow soldiers under his command, and another 3 were seriously injured. Both lost their legs. And I mourn very much for my firstborn son. He was 39 with 6 little children, but he knew that he was going to protect and defend not only the state of Israel and the Jewish people, but he was going to fight evil and fight the Hamas-ISIS axis of evil, and bring some sense of decency to the Middle East, and really as an exemplar for the world.
Well, let me add one more detail. He also left orphaned a 3-month-old son who will never know his father. And it's just absolutely tragic what has happened. In the middle of your grief, you're writing a letter to President Biden. What did you want him to know?
Well, you know, I was on the family bus on the way to Mount Herzl. That's the Mount of Herzl where our soldiers are buried. And I was on the way to my son's funeral. I had written speeches for the prime minister, for many ministers in the government throughout my career. I'd never written a eulogy for my own son. And I was busy making notes on the bus. And suddenly it occurred to me that there would be many people attending. We had many thousands of people attending that would only understand English. So I decided to add an English section to my eulogy, and I suddenly had a eureka moment. I said, well, why don't I write a letter to the president? Why doesn't that be the context of my English remarks? Because the president is from Scranton, Pennsylvania, as I am, and he lost a son. And suddenly I felt a sense of, well, maybe a sense of camaraderie, that he would understand where I was coming from. And I appealed to President Biden to not only support Israel, but do everything in his power to support Prime Minister Netanyahu's government's position that Hamas must be destroyed. Let me explain that, because many people, unfortunately, in the West don't really understand when we say Hamas has to be destroyed. You know, at the end of the Second World War, there was no question that Germany and Japan were defeated. If you went to, a bar in Indonesia and you asked someone that was totally uneducated who won the war, they know, well, they'd say the Nazis were defeated. We need a victory, in this case, against Hamas, which in many cases are even worse than Nazis, because the Nazis try to cover up their tracks. Hamas celebrates their tracks. I mean, we now have accounts of some of the hostages who have been released, children who were forced to watch the slaughter of the innocents of 1,400 people on that day, the 7th of October. And when they cried, a gun was put to their head and they were told to stop crying, otherwise they'd be shot. This is the extent of the depravity that we're dealing with. And if that's not defeated, the entire world is going to suffer, not just Israel. We're at the like my son was at the point command of the division. Israel's at the point command of the free world, of the moral world. This is really a war for sanity, for morality, for ethics, and for light against darkness as we approach the Hanukkah holiday, which is the festival of lights.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a defining moment for our generation. And just as the Allied leaders back in World War II, when there was talk about peace and should we have a cessation of the war and what terms would we accept from Japan and from Germany. And it was Roosevelt was clarion call, no less than unconditional surrender. Until this regime is wiped off the planet, we're not going to stop. That's our goal here. It has to be eliminated. This morning I was reading in the Bible, and it's Ezekiel 33:5, that there are people that hear the alarm and ignore it. Are we in danger of ignoring the alarm that Hamas presents? It's not just to Israel, but in my view, if they're allowed to exist, they're now a threat to the entire world.
Well, you quote Ezekiel, and I'll draw on Isaiah here, who lamented those who confuse truth for lies and light for darkness and good for evil. And we have a situation here where the postmodernist thrust of the past 3-4 decades has corrupted the minds of so many people that there's not just a confusion between what's good and bad or what is good and evil, but actually evil is being interpreted as good. So you have millions of people demonstrating using these kind of code words and catchphrases that they don't even understand. Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Well, basically what you're saying is that Auschwitz is the answer to the Middle East. Eliminate the state of Israel, eliminate the Jews that live here. Celebrating mass murder. My dear friends, I'm on my way. I stopped here for this interview here in Tel Aviv. I'm on my way to a town just south of Tel Aviv to embrace a bereaved family. That's one of the things that I do for my own bereaving moments, is visit with others who are suffering terribly. And they lost a daughter on the 7th of October. She was a young sergeant on an army base, watching the electronic system, and she was incinerated. They don't have a grave to go to. There's nothing left of her. And she was incinerated because she hid in a room in which they threw grenades and then burnt the room with her in it while she was bleeding to death. And then they celebrated. It's all on video. This kind of depravity is being celebrated by people who have simply taken those words of Isaiah and interpreted them. They've confused, they're defining evil as good. And the war that Israel is fighting is for a reversal of that confusion, is for clarity. It's a war of clarity, that there is something called good and there is something called evil, and we can't confuse between the two. And unfortunately, so many of the campuses in the United States have been taken over by this postmodernism, which used to be a playful idea. They didn't believe in anything and just kind of tossed inanities around. But not anymore. This has become a real threat to civilization. So our fight in Gaza is not only a local threat, it's not only a regional battle, it's a global one for sanity against depravity.
You've had messages for Benjamin Netanyahu. What would you advise him right now? We're seeing that there is obvious competing goals. One, the destruction of Hamas, and the other is freeing the hostages. And so these pauses that are happening so that hostages can walk free. Well, what's your advice to him today?
Well, far be it from me to offer him advice on this particular issue. The issue of the hostages versus the immediate continuation of our military efforts is a very, very difficult dilemma. I remember studying in international relations Churchill's dilemma at Coventry, whether or not to clear the city and therefore reveal that they had cracked the enigma. It's a very difficult decision. But one thing I'm very clear on, that at some point, at the right time, Israel must continue the military operation. And we're already sensing that the Biden administration and many in the West, in Europe in particular, are using this hiatus in the battle to not only release hostages, but to put Israel in a position where it will not continue the military operation. If, God forbid, this military operation doesn't continue, my son's life will have been taken in vain, and the blood of all of his comrades, which has been spilt really for not only for Israel, but for, as I said before, civilization. This is a civilizational battle against evil. And it has to be rooted out entirely, the same way the Nazis were defeated entirely. This is the same battle, and it's a modern battle. It's a battle also of ideas, because people have succumbed to this ridiculous notion, that somehow the Hamas is interested in a state, and only if we sit down and negotiate, everything will be fine. Well, read what they say. They don't say they want a state. They want to eliminate Israel. Read what Muslim leaders, Muslim thinkers say about the Muslim Brotherhood. We're talking about intelligentsia within the Muslim world that have written extensively to keep the Muslim Brotherhood out of the Emirates, for example. Why is the Emirates such a successful country? Because they have leadership that has written extensively against the Muslim Brotherhood and operated to keep them out with force. So, people should educate themselves in the West. Read the Islamic literature on the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the parent organization of Hamas ISIS.
Well, Dr. Leiter, thanks for being with us, and just have our assurance we stand with you and we stand with Israel. And I'm very clear in describing Hamas. I view it as this Islamic death cult, that they should not exist anymore. This ideology needs to be completely eliminated. And this is our time. This is everyone who treasures freedom needs to realize this is our time to wake up. This kind of violence, this kind of ideology, this kind of thinking shouldn't exist, and it needs to stop now. This is our moment for our generation to stand with Israel, and that's what we do. Thank you for joining us. May you be comforted in knowing that we stand with you.
I am comforted by that, and God bless your clarity of ideas and your clarity, your moral clarity.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us.